ท่านคะเซสชันต่อไปนะคะจะเป็นบทบาทของทางฝั่ง second party opinion กันบ้างนะคะเราจะมาฟังถึงบทบาทนะคะของ SPO ในกระบวนการออก ESG Bond นะคะเพื่อเป็นการสร้างความเชื่อมั่นให้กับนักลงทุนนะคะเพื่อให้ธุรกิจเนี่ยเป็นไปอย่างโปร่งใสนะคะแล้วก็มีประสิทธิภาพมากขึ้นค่ะสำหรับเซสชันนี้นะคะจะขออนุญาตคอนดักต์เป็นภาษาอังกฤษนะคะ Please note that this session will be conducted in English. Our next session explores the role of second-party opinion in building credibility and investor confidence in ESG bond. Please welcome Mr. Thomas Leonard, Head of Sustainable Finance, the Asia Pacific from DNB Thailand. ค่ะ
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Those of you who were here last year, I think you heard me give part of my speech in Thai, and everybody said it was very, very good. We really liked it. We all understood you, but just please do it in English this year. So I think if everyone's okay, I am going to give my talk in English. I don't think my accent is very good. Let me introduce myself. My name is Thomas Leonard. I'm the Head of Sustainable Finance Assurance Services for DNV. DNV is an international organization. We're based in Oslo, although I personally am based in Bangkok, and I'm responsible for Southeast Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. So I have people working for me in different ASEAN countries as well as Australia. We supply all of those markets. Let me just talk very quickly about what it is we do, what is a second party opinion. And it's pretty straightforward, really. A developer, for example, or an owner wishes to raise funds, for example, to build a sustainable project. So, for example, you might want to build a solar farm, and you need funding to build your solar farm. An investor invests in these projects, and they can invest in the form of bonds or loans or some other financial instrument. By the way, the terms are a little bit confusing, and I will explain this in a minute. The first party is the developer. The second party is the investor. The second party opinion is provided by a third party. I know, it's very confusing. There's a reason for that, and it's historical. The second party opinion was traditionally, it was an organization employed by the first party to conduct a separate analysis. It was always called a second party opinion. It's actually a third party assurance service. We're not the first party, we're not the borrower, we're not the second party, we're not the lender. We are an entirely independent third-party assurance organization. Our job is to provide a report which shows whether or not the proposed financial instrument meets the various different principles or standards, and I'll talk about those in a minute. Let me just talk a bit about I'll talk about the principles and standards in a minute, but let me just talk very quickly about what does a SPO actually do? And a SPO is second party opinion. I use the term SPO in a very general sense. The correct term is an external review, but people use the term SPO. An external review is the proper industry term, because it also includes things like CBI verification services, which is not technically a SPO. But the point is, all of these different types of external review essentially do the same four things. First of all, this is for use of proceeds, by the way. First of all, the most important question. You're raising funds. What are you raising the funds for? They have to be for something real. It has to be something real in the real world. And that thing has to be a green thing, or it has to be a social thing, in accordance with how these things are defined, how they're defined by the principles, how they're defined by the various different taxonomies. This, again, by the way, is use of proceeds. Sustainability linked is slightly different. And part of the second party opinion is to make sure that the funds are actually going to eligible green or social projects. Are they actually going for something which is a genuine social or green activity? They make sure that they're not being allocated to something that's wrong, and they validate the claims of the borrower. There is a difference, by the way. Validate and verify means something slightly different. Verify is something you're talking about the past. Validate is you're talking about the future. Now, the second part, the second principle, process for project evaluation and selection, that's to make sure that the funds are being allocated to their correct, they're being tracked and segregated and properly allocated to the correct form of investment, and this requires a form of project evaluation and selection. So the borrower needs to have a process for doing this. They need to make sure that there's an institution, that there's a body set up within their own organization to make sure those funds are actually going to the right place. This again makes sure that there's transparency and ensures that the funds are being managed correctly. Proceeds management is very similar, but this is not the process. This is explaining how the funds are actually allocated. Obviously, Principle 1 explains, are the use of proceeds eligible use of proceeds, but Principle 3 is telling you how are they actually going to those proceeds. Also a question, are they linked to a sustainability strategy for that organization? This is included within the principles. What we will generally do is we generally want to see that the institution which is actually conducting this form of sustainable activity has at least a general overarching strategy for promoting sustainability. Now, it highlights taxonomy alignments and green certifications. Again, we need to be sure that that the funds are going to something which would be, in theory, could be assessed under a taxonomy or some form of certification. But I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Then finally, reporting. This is actually a very important part of the process. You are required as a borrower to, in accordance with the various different principles and standards, to follow reporting both of impact and of allocation. So again, that was really mostly a little bit of revision. I think most people know this already. But what I want to talk about now is kind of where the market is currently standing and where I think it's heading. Now, there's a long list of of principles and standards here and various different forms of guidelines. And again, I think most of the people in this room will be quite familiar with most of these things. However, I think what's maybe not necessarily immediately obvious is the degree to which these sorts of principles and standards are increasingly being governed by regulations. Really, traditionally, this sort of activity tended to be much more of a voluntary nature. There was really no regulated form of green finance. You were never really required to do this, and also the definition of what was considered to be green and social tended to be quite subjective. It was very much down to the assessor to decide what they considered to be green. Now, there was an exception, of course. The CBI has been around for a long time, and that has always set a taxonomy. It's been around for several years, and that is an actual certification scheme, and that was always considered to be the most rigorous way of doing green labeling. However, I think what you're really finding is that because there are increasingly greater numbers of taxonomies, and also what you're finding is that governments around the world are starting to take an interest in sustainable labeling. You are finding that regulations are starting to creep in, and that certain things are are required or may be required by law in certain places. So a very good example of this is the EU Green Bond standards. The EU Green Bond standards are not, if you want to be called an EU Green Bond in the European Union, you are legally required to follow the European Green Bond standards. It is not voluntary, you have to do it. And you have to follow the European Union taxonomy, and the assessor for your European Union green bonds needs to be qualified to do so. And there's a whole process for being qualified. DNV is qualified to do this in Europe. It's not the case with the ASEAN taxonomy, not yet anyway, and as far as I know, it's not the case in any ASEAN country that this is regulated yet, but it may become at some point in the future. The process, we at DNV follow a process called ISAE 3000, which is the process for performing assurance services. So it is a recognized process for performing this sort of service, and we do this because there are certain liability risks associated with this sort of work. We need to follow a set process to do the work, and there are certain set ways we have to do these assessments. It's really not just our own opinion. There are certain points that we need to raise with potential lenders, and it is becoming much more strict. Whereas previously we might have been required by our own internal governance to do this, and of course we still are required by our own internal governance to do this sort of thing. More and more we're finding we are required to do this by law, and there may be legal liabilities if we don't conduct this in the manner. And what that really brings to in part, is the question of taxonomies. Because the taxonomies really answer the question. For most places, the taxonomy is talking about green. It's not talking about social. There are not, that I am aware of, any threshold-based social taxonomies in existence yet. There are certain taxonomies where guidelines are given for what's considered to be a social activity. The Malaysian taxonomy, for example, does that. But in most cases, when you're talking about a taxonomy, you're talking about green. Now, we at DNV, we can conduct second-party opinions against taxonomies, and we frequently do, even if the customer doesn't actually ask us to conduct against a SPO against a taxonomy. We still have to do it for internal governance processes. So even if it doesn't appear in the final report, I am required for my internal governance process to refer to a taxonomy on our internal quality control system. So you might think, well, why do these taxonomies matter to me? If you're engaging DNV, I can't speak for our competitors, but if you're engaging DNV, we have to show, just for internal governance, that you are meeting some taxonomy, some relevant taxonomy to what you're doing. So the taxonomies are actually important. They do affect how we do these assessments. So this wouldn't have been the case 10 years ago. 10 years ago, there really was only the CBI, or even 5 years ago, there was only the CBI taxonomy, and that was the only benchmark we can use, and really the benchmark was more just our own experience. What have we previously assessed as green in the past? And now that's not the case. We have to look at a taxonomy. Of course, there are a lot of taxonomies out there. There's the Thailand taxonomy, the ASEAN taxonomy, the Singapore taxonomy, the European, the Australian. I could keep going on. Well, you can look at the list here. There's a long list of taxonomies. What I can tell you about this very long list, the simple answer to this is green tends to mean the same thing. Not exactly, but for the most part, green means more or less the same thing. The thresholds tend to be the same. The way in which the assessment is conducted tends to be the same. Again, there are differences, there are distinctions, there are certain activities you get in certain taxonomies and you don't get in others, but generally speaking, green is green. Where the taxonomies tend to deviate a lot is in amber. There's a lot of difference in amber, and again, I think this is understandable. Amber doesn't exist at all in the European Union, or it doesn't really exist in the CBI taxonomy. But it does exist in the ASEAN taxonomy, and it does, of course, in Thailand and Singapore and Indonesia and so on. But they say something very different, and I think, generally speaking, it's very reflective of the particular the particular policy direction of those individual member states. Singapore has a very, very tight amber threshold. ASEAN is a lot looser. Indonesia is even looser than that. Let me move on from there. Now, these are really common features of taxonomy. So every taxonomy, in one way or the other, has all of these things. Actually, sorry, except for the last thing, the transition, but I'll get to that in a minute. Environmental objectives, by definition, every taxonomy is setting environmental objectives. They do them in slightly different ways. The European Union has 7, I think. The ASEAN has 4. They generally do the same sort of thing. And again, as I say, at Green, they tend to be very similar. What's quite different about the ASEAN taxonomy, particularly I would say compared to, let's say, the Singapore and the Thailand taxonomy, the ASEAN taxonomy is very broad in the terms of its environmental objectives. As of now, as far as I'm aware, there are no the Singapore taxonomy, I don't think, has any climate change adaptation. I think Thailand is bringing it in, though, bringing in climate change adaptation, biodiversity, and so on. But they've existed in the ASEAN taxonomy for a few years now. And I think that's actually a very important point, because I know we always think, taxonomy is always about climate change mitigation, but it's not only about climate change mitigation. It's about adaptation. I was driving my car down the Cheng Watana Road 2 days ago, and I was under about that much water. We need to build better drainage on the Cheng Watana Road. So my car doesn't stall. When my son goes to school, sometimes they put a red flag out at the school, and that means the children are not allowed to go out and play. That's not climate change mitigation. That's a local pollution, and that's a problem for Thailand that Thailand needs to address. So it's not just about EO1, not just about climate change mitigation. Circular economy, recycling. Thailand is a country that needs to improve circular economy. There's a lot of opportunities here to promote recycling and so on. Do no significant harm. Now, do no significant harm, until I would say about maybe 5 years ago, DNSH tended to be a bit of an afterthought. It was not really given a lot of consideration. This is wrong. DNSH in a lot of projects is the main part of the project. If you're building a wind farm, or if you're building building the mass transit system, something like the MRT or the BTS, they are automatically green. A wind farm is always considered green. The MRT is always considered green. But they aren't automatically considered to pass DNSH, to do no significant harm. You can do a lot of harm to the environment with a wind farm, and that's something that needs to be considered, or a solar farm. The ASEAN taxonomy has a very structured way of doing this, by the way. I think it's the best way because I wrote it. But obviously DNSH is something which appears in other taxonomies as well. The technical screening criteria are really functions of the environmental objectives. Sometimes they are quantitative, sometimes they are qualitative. I do always want to make the point here, by the way, there's always a bit of a misconception about TSCs. There's this idea that, TSCs have to be quantitative. They have to be based on numbers. How many grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour? It's not really a TSC. That's not true. It's not true in the European Union taxonomy. It's not true in Thailand. It's not true in ASEAN. A lot of TSCs are things like you need to achieve a certain certification. This is still a TSC, and it's still a qualitative TSC. And for things like climate change adaptation, it's mostly qualitative TSCs. Social standards. Social standards tend to be in ASEAN, they basically come down to obey the law. If you are obeying the law in Thailand, you are almost certainly following the social standards. Things like forced labor, things like child labor, things like considering local communities. These are already laws in Thailand. So as long as you can demonstrate you're obeying the law, You can regard yourself as being aligned with the social activities. I want to talk a bit about transition now. I think this is really the next big thing. And it's true in Thailand, but it's also true in other ASEAN countries as well. Green, as I've said, green tends to be pretty straightforward. It's the same thing in the European Union as it is in ASEAN, more or less. What's considered to be transitional is very different, though. And it's always, what is transition by definition? It is about change. It's, I am here, I need to be here. How do I get from here to here? I have a lot of coal-fired power stations. I still need to make electricity, but I need to decarbonize. How do I get from having coal-fired power stations, maybe to having gas-fired power stations, maybe to having solar power stations? And you need to describe a pathway to achieving this. Now, the ASEAN taxonomy does set effectively sets a pathway for achieving transition, because it sets TSC. It in fact sets, in this case, quantitative TSC for power generation, which are reduced over time. But having said this, when you're talking about something like a portfolio or an entity, you're not talking about one power station. You might be talking about a portfolio that's got coal, it's got gas, it's got solar, it's got wind, it's got hydro, it's got all these things mixed together, and you need to come to a position: is this portfolio, is this entity on a pathway to transition? This is very much something which is still under consideration within the ASEAN taxonomy. There is, however, an ASEAN taxonomy, ASEAN transition finance guidance, which has been developed. It's very much aimed at EO1, however. It's aimed at climate change mitigation, and it basically requires, for an assessment of transition, to demonstrate a pathway which is where you are getting to a science-based situation, for generation or for whatever whatever is contained within your portfolio. Okay, I'm just going to mention a couple of. How am I doing for time, by the way? Am I all right for time? A couple of examples here. This is a second-party opinion which we did for PEA, the Provincial Electricity Authority in Thailand. I'm sure you all know it very well. This was back in 2024. We conducted a second-party opinion for projects which were in part related to interconnections between the mainland of Thailand, Koh Samui and Koh Phangan, and also for various smart grid projects. The interconnector to Koh Samui, interestingly, was not assessed under EO1. It was assessed under EO2, which is the climate change adaptation, because it was regarded as a form of adaptation. The interconnector to Koh Samui is necessary in part because it's needed for the islands to remain secure. I mean, partly just generally to remain secure, but also considering the fact that the islands are going to be stressed considerably more in the future by climate change. The islands are already need to import water from the mainland. They are going to have to install desalination, and as well as having to install things like electric transportation. And it is necessary to have those interconnectors in order to meet adaptation requirements. So the interconnectors are considered green under EO2. That isn't to say they can't be green under EO1 as well, but that's not what the basis of the assessment was. Now, the other case study I would like to talk about was, this is climate transition in Japan. Japan is really quite far ahead of everybody else when it comes to climate transition. They take a slightly different philosophy to how activities are considered to be green or transitional, and they have a very strong set of transition guidance. So it's very common in Japan for portfolios or entities to be assessed on the basis of their transition. And again, the way this works is it's essentially you need to understand what the entity, so what the company, in this case it's actually the government of Japan. This is the sovereign bond for Japan, and it relates to many different different activities. So it's power generation, it's transportation, and various different things as well. Sorry, I need my glasses and I can tell you what it says here. So again, industry, households, and so on. I think you're going to need more of this sort of thing in ASEAN. There is still a lot of need for many ASEAN countries, and that includes Thailand, but particularly you're looking at places like Indonesia, the Philippines, and to some extent Malaysia, to invest in the sort of infrastructure which is necessary to go through transition. And we're talking about things like power generation, we're talking about things like transportation, so about train links, about mass transit systems, about electrical interconnectors, and not just within the member states, but also between member states. As ASEAN, unlike the European Union, where you can buy a kilowatt of electricity in Ireland and you can sell it in Greece, it's not so easy to buy a kilowatt of electricity in Myanmar and sell it in Papua. That's not possible in ASEAN at the moment, and it's partly it's a commercial issue, but partly it's also just a physical issue. There is no interconnector between those places. That's my final slide. You can see I've been making use of my subscription for making Ghibli pictures. So I don't know if there's any questions at this point.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leonard, for the informative and insightful presentation. Now we would like to open the floor for a Q&A session. If you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or submit your question through the event platform. ท่านได้มีคำถามเรียนเชิญนะคะ Or maybe later during the coffee break.
Sure.
All right. So thank you very much again, Mr. Thomas Leonard, for your valuable insights. ขอเสียงปรบมือให้กับคุณโทมัส เรียลนาร์ดด้วยค่ะขอบพระคุณค่ะค่ะทุกท่านคะจบไปเรียบร้อยนะคะสำหรับการบรรยายที่ให้ทางความรู้นะคะแล้วก็ข้อมูลเชิงลึกเกี่ยวกับบทบาทของ second party opinions ค่ะในการเสริมสร้างความน่าเชื่อถือนะคะให้กับ ESG Bond ในวันนี้ค่ะเดี๋ยวจะขอเชิญทุกท่านนะคะพักรับประทานอาหารว่างนะคะสักประมาณ15 นาทีแล้วกลับมาพบกันค่ะขอบคุณค่ะ